My name's Don Miller. I'm the author of Vicksburg, Grant's Campaign That Broke the Confederacy, and you're watching A House Divided.
If you're watching this afterwards on YouTube, you can probably still order a signed book, first edition, as long as we do have them, because this is a popular book and we may not have all of them for too long. I want to give a special welcome to Tom McCarthy's history class at the St. Louis University High School. Tom was in here a few days ago and said that all of you will be watching. We appreciate that as always, and we await your question. But a reminder to everyone, if you can have questions come in earlier than later, that's going to help, because near the end we may not be able to put it in, but I'd like to put in as many as we can. I just want to tell you that we've already had a number of fine books actually come through here this fall, and as a holiday gifts, these still are wonderful, and we have a number of them still here. Certainly Blumenthal's wonderful third volume of his book on the political aspects of Lincoln's life. So this is still here, and we still have volume 2 as well, and we'll let you know when volume 4 comes up next year. We also had Hirsch and Van Haften in here for the Tyranny of Public Discourse, Abraham Lincoln's 6-element antidote for meaningful and persuasive writing. And this is still available. It's good for kids and grandkids and adults, anyone who'd like to improve their writing skills. And of course, we're going to have, as I said, today's book as well. So let's get to that right now. We're very pleased to have Don Miller here. He's the John Henry McCracken Professor of History Emeritus at Lafayette College. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He's hosted, co-produced, or was an historical consultant for more than 30 television documentaries. He's the author of 10 books, including D-Days in the Pacific, The Story of the World War II, The City of the Century, The Epic of Chicago and Making of America, The Mysteries of the Air, America's Bomber Boys, which is being...
Masters of the Air.
Masters, what did I... Here it is, Masters.
Okay.
Sorry. Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys, being made into a movie by Spielberg and Tom Hanks. His latest book, Vicksburg, Grant's Campaign That Broke the Confederacy, by Simon & Schuster, 463 pages with illustrations and maps, and is $35. It truly has breadth and military history at its best. I love the cover, although it might give away the ending, so I won't tell you how this book ends today. But Faulkner's novel, Absalom Absalom, seems to have been the seed that led to this book. So please explain.
Yeah, I was intent on not writing a straight bullet-by-bullet military history. I wanted to combine social history with military history. And especially after reading Absalom Absalom, I knew I had to get race into this issue. And one of the things that I found transfixing about Vicksburg is the Delta, which is this vast swamp just north of Vicksburg. And Faulkner in Absalom Absalom doesn't talk about the Delta, but he has a character named Thomas Sutpen who arrives in the 1830s in a town near, a fictional town called Jefferson, Mississippi, and it's right near Oxford, Mississippi. And he rides into town, 2 saddlebags, no other belongings, and he has 10 or 11 Haitian slaves. He was an overseer in Haiti. They go out into the swamp and they coat themselves with clay, and they go into the swamps naked and work shoulder to shoulder, pulling timber out of the felled timber out of the swamp. They build a house, a so-called plantation house, a big spread. It has nothing inside it, no chandeliers, no silverware, no doorknobs, no nothing. He has his slaves go to the river with a wagon and pick up all these accoutrements, rugs and carpet, and carpet hangings and pictures and everything else. And all of a sudden, he's a plantation grandee. And I thought to myself, this is exactly what happened in the Vicksburg Delta. it was a sudden eruption of semi-civilization, a frontier civilization. This isn't Margaret Mead's Gone with the Wind, which is actually published in the same year as Absalom Absalom. And you get a sense of, it gave me a clue to two things. One, why the Confederates fought and the Vicksburgians held on with such tenacity during the war. They had just built this world. It's entirely new. And I kept thinking, too, of the Philip farmers and you know, in the fields and the kind of capitalist titans I talked about in Chicago. They built their own business. Very hard for them to deal with labor coming in and trying to tell them wages, hours, things like it's theirs. And the other thing that struck me is at the end of the book, Thomas Sutpin and his son, they go to war and they come back and there's nothing there. Plantation's gone, grounds are fallow, slaves are gone. And I thought to myself, the guy who did that was shelving saddlebags in a hardware store in Galena, Illinois in 1860, and tears this society apart, brick by board. And I thought, that's really the gist of what I wanted to get at there. A Civil War history that also deals very strongly with the liberation issue, with the race issue, and with the newness of the so-called Western Confederacy.
You know, it's interesting that two people you would not have expected to be able to prosecute and win a civil war, Lincoln and Grant, came from really literally almost nowhere with not a lot of experience. And so they were able to do that. So yes, this really is two books in one in a way that are kind of logically bound together. And you kind of give equal weights because there's a wider story than just the military history to tell. Now, Vicksburg had a large number of witnesses to this. While they were under siege for so long, there's certainly a huge amount or larger than number of diaries that are there and letters written from within, from, as you say, diary writing daughters. So there's certainly a lot of material for you to work up with. Is that correct?
Yes, there is. I found an abundance of published and unpublished diaries. One of the more fascinating ones was by the granddaughter of Joseph Davis, Jefferson Davis's brother. And I found that diary in the Jackson Archives, 500 pages, unpublished. That was fascinating. She didn't live inside Vicksburg, but she lived on a plantation just south of it. But inside the city, women are furiously writing. They're inside, they built caves into the sides of the hills in Vicksburg to protect themselves against mostly mortar bombardment by David Dixon Porter's fleet. But they go back to their homes, and during the siege, they're writing these letters, and they're writing letters that turn in, and they're doing diary entries. And you get a real sense. I did a book that you mentioned, Masters of the Air, about how the Germans held up or didn't hold up under the bombing. And that helped me a lot to get at the psychology of these people. And I thought, here is a woman with her 4 kids, and it was mostly women and children in these caves. The men were out on the line. And these are the wives of the soldiers who are fighting. And although a lot of people weren't killed in Vicksburg by bombardment, maybe fewer than 15, it was absolutely a horrific experience inside those caves when these gigantic, you know, 250, 260-pound siege mortars come piling into the hills around you, which they literally shake the earth. And you think of a mother sitting in there with her terrified children screaming, candlelit. I kept thinking of German families in World War II in the same kind of situations in their coal cellars in Munich or in Hamburg, and helped me a lot to understand, you know, what was going on inside the city.
Beforehand, we were talking about Ed Barse, and who is the icon of icons in Civil War, correct? And it's been a long time since there's been a battle book on Vicksburg. When I think of Gettysburg, I think of John Batchelder. When I think of Vicksburg, I do think of Ed Barse. I think from now on, with this, we're going to think of Don Miller, because this really is a total experience of what Vicksburg campaign was, from all elements, from the military down to the children, as you say. So what influence, briefly, did Ed Barse have on you, and is he still worth reading?
Yeah, it is worth reading. He has a 3-volume study, and, you know, an abundance of shorter articles about it, and Ed's like, I think of Coddington in Gettysburg, you know, the Bible of the battlefield, and Coddington's from Lafayette College, you know, I succeeded him at Lafayette College. And, well, Ed's like that. He's the guy you go to, and he's a magnificent guide to the battlefield. The first time I went down to Vicksburg was in person was '97. I'd been thinking about this book and done some archival work, but you have to go to the sites, of course. And I ran into Ed Bars, and on his own, he volunteered to give me a tour of the battlefield. It was sensational. Yeah. I mean, I could hear the bullets flying all around me, you know, and then later in the evening, we were having dinner, and he said, I guess half humorously, he said, you know, Miller, why you're going to write the best book on Vicksburg? And I said, no, Ed. He said, because you don't know a damn thing about it.
That's good.
He said, you'll probably bring a fresh perspective to this thing. You know, we're banging around in the trees.
He knew too much about it.
Maybe you can see it from the woods.
But it's good for that. He's very good for that, to know the name of the tree that Grant was standing next to.
And you depend on him, you know. I mean, he works entirely from the official records, and his stuff has credibility. It's legit.
Someone else who had an influence on you, I saw in the book, was John Simon. Now, John Simon began his career as a book boy here in the Abraham Lincoln
Well, I
Bookshop.
didn't know that.
He did,
but
exactly.
I knew he worked here, but I didn't know he began here.
He began here, and he always said to me afterwards, I have his job. Well, I always told him, I'm glad you have yours.
Yeah.
You've made much more of a contribution. But you said that he gave you a fresh perspective on Grant's private and inner life. How so?
Well, we had John up to WGBH Studios in Boston. I was working on as a writer on a documentary on Ulysses Grant. And we have a thing called Grant Week, where we bring in all the leading Grant biographers, and of course, John's the editor of the Grant papers. And he kept saying, there's too much hagiography on Grant. There's too much of the kind of marble man idea that's often, you know, applied to Lee, you know, the general who never made a mistake. And he said, get in there and try to understand that he's fighting two battles at the same time. And he's fighting a battle against, three battles actually. Initially a battle against poverty, which explains his pre-war period. Consistently a battle against, you know, a battle to beat the bottle. And with his drinking, and he's fighting the Confederacy. And this explains, he said, his relentless resolve. That famous quote from one of his officers that you look at Grant and he has on his countenance you see a guy who maybe wants to drive his head through a brick wall.
Yeah.
And the guy who never turns around and things like that. But he said, watch for the points where Grant, and this happened several times in Vicksburg, where he shows his vulnerability. He writes to Julia on a number of occasions that he expects to be removed. And when my editor was reading the book chapter by chapter as I was writing, he kept saying to me, no modern general could survive this. You know, the setbacks that Grant incurred. And to have Lincoln actually send a spy down there and things like that.
We'll get to him.
Yeah, but that's where John was good. He said, watch particularly the letters with Julia, and you'll see the vulnerability. And a little bit of that insecurity seeps in there.
But he seemed to have had a bunch of resilience to
Amazing.
him. Where did that come from? Innate, do you think?
I don't know. His mother was, his father was, of course, a braggart, and, you know, the town businessman, very successful network of leather goods stores, things like that, an abolitionist, which Grant wasn't at the beginning of the war. His mother had this quiet patience, and I think his reticence and his self-control, and he's a very self-enclosed guy, too, and he doesn't reveal himself. Sherman once said that, I think Grant understands me, but no one will ever understand Grant.
You know, that's very much like Lincoln.
Yeah.
His friends say, we have him surrounded. I say that. But it's true. They didn't really understand the essential Lincoln, and we're all trying to figure that out from the words here or the actions there, and the same with Grant, it seems.
Years ago, I was talking to Gore Vidal about that, who wrote, I think, you know, a terrific novel on Grant, where he bases
Not so much on Lincoln, by the way.
No. But he brings Grant into the story pretty well, and I think he does a good job with Hay and Nicolai. And if they couldn't understand him, and they're around him all the time, and these are young aides, you know, very sharp kids almost, and but he, no, nobody ever quite got him. Sherman didn't get him.
Yeah.
Nobody got him.
Both of them are kind of tough to really know.
Yeah.
We had a wonderful lithograph in the shop that came out in January of '62, right after Stanton took over from Cameron. And it's interesting that the generals they thought might be winning the war, the ones at the top are Pope and Shields. I don't think they did, yeah. And meanwhile, Grant is way at the bottom with a beard. And so what I'm going to ask you is, how long did that beard last?
Well, not very long. No, actually, for a long time, nobody knew in the East what Grant looked like. So you have in Harper's Weekly all these lithographs and things, and he looks tremendously different than what he really was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Stanton didn't recognize him when he first met him, and yeah.
Now, Cairo, which is further south than Richmond, by the way,
it is.
Really is a southern or middle state at best. Lincoln grew up in the middle in a boundary state. But Cairo was where it all began. And it was bordered by 2 slave states.
Yep, Kentucky and Missouri.
And the only Illinois regiment came from that little Egypt area of a Confederate
Logan's
regiment.
boys.
And so please describe Cairo's import, especially at the beginning of the campaign.
Well, it's a godforsaken mud hole at the beginning. Charles Dickens seen it in 1842 and wrote a novel centered in Cairo. But I have a picture in the book of Cairo, the mud hole, and with the Illinois Central, of course, ran in there. They had to run it in on the levees because if you ran it in on the basin would get flooded, during the high season of the river. And but Grant arrives there, and in this god-awful mosquito-ridden place, and begins to turn it into the largest military installation in the West. Everything that went to Vicksburg, bullets, cannons, troops, nurses, medicine, came from Cairo. The major telegraph station ran from Memphis up to Cairo, and Cairo had a direct connection to Washington, D.C. Sherman was stationed there for a while, feeding Grant supplies from there in Paducah when Grant was fighting down in Fort Donelson and things like that. So it's the center of everything. And that's where Grant begins. And one of my favorite scenes in the memoirs is, and I describe it in the book as well, and is Grant arriving there. I mean, he doesn't have enough money. He's a newly minted brigadier general. And he reads about it in the newspaper. Doesn't have time to buy a uniform, shows up in an old brown business suit, and you got it. An old brown business suit. Nobody meets him at the station. And he walks to the local headquarters, which is in a bank building. And no one's paying any attention to him. It's crowded, a lot of kinetic activity in the building. He picks up what would ordinarily be a bank slip and writes out his orders, taking over the command, and handed it to a guy who looked at him like, did this guy drop out from Pluto or somewhere like that? And he's the new commander.
It's interesting. The same thing happened to me at the Willard Hotel later in the war.
Yeah, with his son. Yeah, with the clerk.
So here we have a little endorsement signed by him from Cairo as a brigadier general. You don't see that very often. And so what I'd love to know is, what did the surrounding citizenry think about this? I mean, was this a Union occupation to them?
Absolutely. And they had the governor of Illinois, just after Fort Sumter, rushed troops down there because there were rumors of a Confederate takeover, of a coup d'etat. And they got the Illinois troops there just in time. And those brass cannons convinced a lot of people to go to the other side. But always on the edge, always on the edge. And like you say, it's in a district they call Little Egypt, and it's pro-slavery, corn and hog farmers down there. John Logan, as I mentioned before, who served Grant brilliantly throughout the Vicksburg campaign, came from that area. And he, like a lot of the soldiers, changed a lot during the war and came around to the idea that slavery had to be eliminated.
Now, Grant moved south.
Yeah.
And through a series of battles, etc. And in a footnote on page 332, you write about whether James Wilson or Admiral Farragut actually helped shape Grant's decision to move south. And you dismissed both claims because there's no evidence.
There's none.
Did Grant himself then devise the plan, or might both Wilson and Farragut both be right, coming up with a plan somewhat simultaneously, since it's a logical plan?
Yeah. Well, Wilson came up with his plan earlier, and in conversation with Rawlins, when they first got to Vicksburg, when Grant arrived there in late January of 1863. And they were looking at Vicksburg from across the river. It's a mile-wide river there, and they're trying to decide how to take it. And while the generals are deliberating, Rawlins and Wilson are talking, and Wilson said, well, I think the thing to do is get below Vicksburg. But both Lincoln claimed at the end of the war that it was his idea to go there, although he never conveyed it to Grant. And Grant said after the war that it was his idea to go south. But you couldn't go south at the time because Louisiana was flooded. There were entire towns underwater, New Carthage and places like that. And it's an area of jungle-like bayous and serpentine rivers, tough place to cross. But he only goes there eventually when the waters recede. And it's probably the lowest point of his life. He'd just been in the swamps north of Vicksburg for a time. You know, he sent an expedition up there with Porter and went part of the way and then turned back and released Sherman to go up. So there's Sherman and Porter, and that's the big partnership, Sherman, Porter, and Grant, and 5 ironclad gunboats going into this heart of darkness, this unbelievable swamp. And Lincoln went crazy when he found out. He and Halleck, you know, what's he doing there? And they almost get, well, they do get, Porter gets ambushed. And at one point fears that there's about 400 Confederates surrounding his boats. They fell trees into the swamp, into, you know, in the water he's trying to get through there. He can't back out, he can't move forward, and they're about to attack. And Sherman's not there yet. Sherman's behind with some troops. He sends a slave back, Porter does, with a message. Sherman gets there just in time. 3 of Grant's officers have been shot, not all killed, but they've been shot, and the Confederates have attacked the boats. And Porter said later, and in the official record, that he, and in his memoirs, that he planned to blow the boats up if the Confederates boarded. He had put slick mud on the sides of the boats to make it hard to board the boats. He handed out rifles to his sailors and said, look, if we lose this hand-to-hand fight, we head for the forest and we blow the boats. And imagine if that had happened, and Sherman had been captured, and Porter had been captured, and they lose the 5 gunboats. They're done at Vicksburg. They're done. And that often isn't, I don't see it emphasized anywhere in the literature.
Thankfully it wasn't, I guess, for the end of the war.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the inland waters. We have a theater map that we can show.
Okay.
And you write that Grant was a master
River
at using
warrior.
enemy waters to his advantage. Were the inland waters more crucial in the West than they were ever in the East?
Absolutely, because the waters in the West, there's a little story about Grant just before he arrived at Cairo, which was a guy named John Emerson, a friend of his who later served, pointed out. And Grant was staying in a cabin on Emerson's land, and he saw Grant in the morning leaning over a map of the Mississippi Valley and marking with the red crayons the waters, just the waters you're describing, that he needed to conquer. And these waters in the West run south to north, okay? Straight down laterally. And the Confederates are building forts along them. Grant sees them as highways of invasion. This is the Cumberland River, the Tennessee River, and of course the Mississippi River. In the east, the streams run east to west in the Tidewater area in Virginia. So you're surmounting them. Grant's using waters to move troops with tremendous speed. And the troops talk about that in their letters. And even the reporters talk about it. They liked covering the West because they could ride in comfortable steamers and move from spot to spot.
The railroads then were not as important by any means.
No.
Much more in the East than in the West.
Yeah, much more in the East.
We have a question from David in Northridge, California.
Okay.
Who wants to know just what we're talking about, the inland waters. What about that canal? They were trying to get around that horseshoe bend at Vicksburg, and they were going to build a canal. Why didn't that work?
Well, it's a peninsula that sticks out like a thumb into the river, and he would cut a canal at the base of the thumb there, so far inland that troop ships running by there to get south of Vicksburg would not be vulnerable to Confederate fire from the town itself. Vicksburg was strongest on its front side, the side in front of the river batteries, and Lincoln wanted a canal there. They tried it in 1862. The Navy tried it. It failed. Grant's first obligation when he got there, he was against this idea, but it's Lincoln's orders. First thing, he puts McClernand and Sherman to work on the thing. It doesn't work because the river just won't get in there fast enough to scour and get that canal at a proper depth and to move the water quickly through it. And what actually happened is the river would overflow the levees, overflow the canal. There's plenty of water in the canal, just not moving, and flood the camps. So the soldiers, and this is like the Valley Forge of the Civil War, they have to live, their encampments at that point, in Young's Point, are on top of the levees where they're burying bodies. Mary Livermore from Chicago, an aid worker with a Christian organization in Chicago, and the Sanitary Commission as well, her and a woman named Mary Hodge, both of them describe incidents where they're coming up on Vicksburg, and what do they see first? Coffins in the river and floating bodies. Because the river would overflow and it would cause a crevasse, as it's called, a break in the levee, and the bodies would just be shot out into the river. Horrible, horrible scene. And those troops suffered tremendously that winter, that January, February, and early March of '63.
I want to go back to something you said about Grant and his use of freedmen and blacks in the armies.
Yeah.
And we once had a wonderful note from Grant before Vicksburg in which he was saying, I think it was June 15th, that he was arming Negroes, as he said, to guard plantations owned by the government.
Absolutely.
And this is before, and Stanton backed him up, and this is certainly before Lincoln was ready to arm
Absolutely. Blacks,
but here he was, maybe not in battle, but at least arming for plantations and other things as well. So might this have been a result of the huge number, of influx of slaves becoming freedmen by entering the army? In the East, I don't have one of these to show you, but here's a pamphlet, it was much smaller than this, that the armies were giving out. Certainly in the East, and I'm wondering if they were doing this after emancipation in the West as they went forward and showing giving these pamphlets to the slaves, you're free. Anyone who could read would be able to read it to them. So were they handing these out also?
Yes, they were, especially when Lorenzo Thomas, the Adjutant General, goes west with express orders from Stanton and Lincoln to begin to recruit slaves actively for military service. And they did perform garrison duty. They were given rifles. I mean, the first blacks who fight in the Civil War fight not at Fort Wagner, but just before that at Milliken's Bend, guarding in Grant's supply station at Milliken's Bend. They were surprised. They were hit by a surprise attack by a group of Texans. They were ill-trained. Some of them just received rifles that week. And they were slaughtered, but they held with the help of Porter's gunboats. Without that gunboat, they would all have been slaughtered. But they fought with tremendous courage. And that convinced a lot. Word got out. It spread through the camps. Charles Dana talked about that, Lincoln's representative down there, and said it changed a lot of Army guys' attitudes toward the blacks. Because the big question was, will they fight?
Yeah.
But Grant always believed they'd fight. If properly trained, they'd fight. And he thought, and one of the reasons he gets involved in this issue is, you alluded to it, it's a brilliant idea. He can't move an army. Here's his dilemma. If slaves come behind the lines, they're automatically free by the Confiscation Act, which is the summer of 1862, even before the Emancipation Proclamation. So they're free forever if they come behind the lines. So just before he invades northern Mississippi, they pour into his lines. And he sets up in the West the first contraband camp and uses white and black soldiers eventually to guard these camps. And he has a guy named John Eaton, erect these camps all along the Mississippi Valley, all the way down to Vicksburg, along the river. And Lincoln said later, this is what we're going to do when we take Vicksburg. We're going to use black soldiers to control the river, which is now a Yankee River, and prevent access to the Western Confederacy from the east with these garrisons.
We had another question that came in from Facebook. Thank you. Steve in Des Moines, we appreciate this. Could you speak on that, the difficulties in communications between Grant and his units spread out over rivers, swamp, bogs, etc., how it affected the course of his campaign?
Well, that's a great question.
Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. They did lay telegraph line, but when they're on the move, they can't. And they can't lay telegraph into the... See, 3 of the expeditions that Grant mounts are in the swamps above Vicksburg in the Yazoo Delta. And the only way he can communicate is by courier and by tugs. And these tugs take often 5 or 6 days. You're only covering 75, 80 miles, but it's like this, you know. And as Mark Twain said, the river has its own, attitude and moves where it wants to move. And these courier boats are very slow. So that's why it's such a good question. Grant is actually making decisions that are not congruent with actual facts at the face of battle because it's too late. The battle's changed. He sends a relief expedition, for example, to save an expedition he sent in there. And actually that first expedition didn't need to be saved. It was already backing out. So communications was tremendously important. But by the way, one thing that gave the Union an advantage, and this is often under the label transportation, but it's communication, the fact that he has the Navy and it can go anywhere. And they had things called tin clads. And they could ride on mist, for God's sakes. And the gunboats didn't have a lot of displacement as well. So they could get into some really tough spots.
Let's talk about those gunboats, because Gideon Welles gave up some of his control to the Army, for heaven's sakes. And did he not care about keeping control, or was there not an intermilitary rivalry, perhaps? At the same time, what did the Army know how to use a gunboat? We just saw the Cairo as a gunboat. Did that change in time? Did the Army understand how to use it?
The Army had the control of the gunboats actually initially, and Gideon Welles fought a battle, an inter-service battle with the Army, and Lincoln sided with him, and Stanton wanted. It's favoring the Army, but actually Gideon Welles and Porter won that battle, and they gained control of the gunboats. But Grant, you see, couldn't order around Porter. They're independent, yet they work together hand in glove in complete harmony. And Porter said there wasn't a single instance where he disagreed with Grant, but there wasn't a single instance where he didn't operate in harmony with Grant throughout the entire, and that's unbelievable in the Civil War.
Lincoln, of course, was interested in technology. Did he have any input or thoughts on the gunboats, or is that so far away from his own experience going down the Mississippi?
He's more concerned. He's more concerned about the blockade and blockade runners and the
French. Did he have to approve the construction? Sure.
When Eads brought the boats in, that went to the War Department and it crosses Lincoln's desk. Yep. Absolutely. And he was curious about the gunboat. He was curious about every aspect of this thing.
Talking about the gunboats, and we showed one of them, as I said before. Churchill called the landing ship tank, or the LST, the most important ship of them all during World War II. Ike named the LSTs one of the 4 crucial weapons to have won World War II.
That and the Jeep.
And that in the Jeep, and I forgot to put down what the others were. But because the LSTs were so crucial in the most important operation of the war, which was Normandy, maybe this is one of the most important operations for boats at that time. Were they crucial to the eventual fall of Vicksburg? More than maybe the blockade even?
They're as important as the Higgins boats, as they were called, because they're made by the Higgins Company in New Orleans. But I'm partial to that because I'm a presidential counsel at the World War II Museum, and Higgins is a big deal down there. But anyway, yes, I would say when Grant goes across the river, when he finally marches an army through partially flooded Louisiana, gets below Vicksburg, and has to cross, the gunboats take him across. And that's the Civil War's D-Day. There isn't that's the largest American amphibious invasion until the actual invasion of Normandy. So the boats are absolutely crucial to the campaign. Grant said after the war that with double the number of men, he couldn't have taken Vicksburg without Porter and the gunboats.
Now, as a preamble to the question from the AP U.S. History class, history at St. Louis University High School, we appreciate this question. One of the things I was thinking about the East and the West later on is Vicksburg really the Avis to Gettysburg? Should we not be thinking that? Was Vicksburg that important? Because what the AP class says, if the Union does not capture Vicksburg in 1863, if they don't capture it, what would have been the impact on Grant, on Lincoln's election, and perhaps the outcome of the war? Do you, in your estimation?
Well, I think if he doesn't capture it, he and Sherman are removed, and so is Porter. They're sent elsewhere. And I think Sherman indicated this on several occasions when he was in trouble with Lincoln. He would have quit, and he threatened to quit a number of times. After he was defeated at a place called Chickasaw Bayou, which occurred in December of '62 when they had an overland invasion, and he went down the river with an expedition and was slaughtered in front of Vicksburg. He threatened to resign. Grant wanted to walk away earlier in the war when Halleck was hard on him. And so absolutely, that's a great question. I can't see it happening. That's why I think Vicksburg is so decisive. Grant thought of war as a process of campaigns, not individual battles. And he and Sherman both believed that the battles in the East, Titanic, Chancellorsville, Antietam, Gettysburg, but then with long interludes between them, that wasn't the way to win war. The way to win war was to fight with resolve and relentlessness and never cease. And that's the kind, I think the most important outcome of Vicksburg. Yeah, they split the river. That was hugely important. They captured an army, hugely important. And it's a Yankee river now, and the Western Confederacy's cut off. But I think the most important, result of the battle is Grant takes that style of warfare he fought at Vicksburg and brings it east. And you see it in Phil Sheridan and Shenandoah and other places. This is hard war on civilian property as well as war on soldiers. And it's relentless, and it does it. And it's also coordinated, where several army groups are working in concert. And that's how he ran the Vicksburg campaign. And Sherman actually learned how to fight that way, the way he fought in Georgia. He fought that way under Grant. Bruce Catton once said that the real man of iron was Grant, not Sherman. Yeah.
Well, total war, you might say, started here.
Yes.
And that's really where Sherman maybe got his idea. Well, that's how we'll proceed and win this war, yes?
It is. In the beginning, actually, it's the troops who take control, and this is what I try to point out. Grant has to manage what you could, I think you could correctly call a social revolution. The young troops, especially from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, coming down, new recruits, they're hard to control. And they begin to see that even though they don't come from abolitionist families, that if they take a slave and bring it into the Union lines, that hurts the Confederacy. And I get letters from fathers, for example, in Southern Illinois who are writing to their sons, you come home. You didn't sign up to fight a war to emancipate slaves. You fought to save the Union. And the son writes back, we hurt them. We hurt them when we take their slaves. The slaves are building their fortifications. The food, they're growing cotton in the fields. The cotton is sold and for rifles and cannon and things like that. And Sherman, and this often led to and spilled over into pillage, where they're actually burning enormous numbers of plantations. Yes, they're shooting the hounds that go after the slaves and destroying the stocks and things like that, but they're also inside the houses stealing silverware, hams, turkeys, everything. And Sherman had strict rules. He actually threatened to hang any man who went into a private home. He never did it. But he and Grant were very upset. They wanted discipline. So they opposed this at first. But later, it becomes almost official policy. Grant gets word from Halleck and Lincoln later that the war has entered a new stage. This is in April 1863, where there's going to be no peace treaty. This is going to be a war to the death. Adam Badeau, you have the books back
right here.
Yeah. He said that you have two sides fighting for national survival. And wars like that don't end easily. Sherman pointed out that wars don't wind down. They speed up at the end. They get worse at the end. Same thing happened in World War II.
So the bottom line is the experience with the other might change both sides' minds.
Precisely.
And that's for today as well.
That's for
Experience with
today,
the
right.
other is important because experience will solidify some sort of communications, and that's important. Now,
Yeah.
what was happening when Charles Dana was sent there by Lincoln, and what was the politics of that moment? And here was a spy in there. So give us a brief overview.
Well, you know, I'll connect it to what I said before. When Porter almost loses his gunboats, and with Sherman, they back out of the bayous. It's late March, and right at that time, Lincoln's had it. He kept writing through Halleck to Grant to get out of those swamps and get up on the Mississippi and get below Vicksburg. And he's frustrated, and he sends down Dana, who's an employee of the War Department, kind of a minister at large, and he's pretending he's working for the Paymaster Department. But Grant smells it out from the beginning, and so did his whole camp. And they do a smart thing. They had meetings before Dana arrived. Treat him well, bring him into the camp, make him a fellow soldier. And Dana took a keen liking for Sherman especially, and then got to know Grant and really respected him and supported him throughout the war. So he's writing in cipher and in code back to Secretary Stanton, reporting on Grant's every movement. And he said, hold on to this guy. He's got a plan, and the plan eventually worked, and that was to have Porter run the batteries at Vicksburg and send the transports down a little later. They would run the batteries as well. And with the gunboats and the transports, we can take the army across from Louisiana and invade Mississippi.
A yes or no answer. We just talked about Adam Badeau back here,
Yeah.
3 volumes, and I've sold bunches of those, and people have read them. You call him Grant's echo.
Yeah.
So can we still rely
I
on the
think
memoirs?
it's reliable. I really do. I mean, there's some historians who denigrate his contribution. Of course, he had arguments with Grant about the autobiography, where he was
Yep,
claiming
that was
that
afterward.
that was afterwards, and I think that's given him a bad reputation. But he follows Grant, began his memoirs much earlier than you think. He's writing for magazines.
Yes.
And he's writing reports on, long reports on the battle. And Badeau follows those very closely and adds his own. He's a good writer. And it's Victorian style, a lot of embellishment and things like that. It's rich, but I think it's accurate.
We have another question, I think based on what I brought in there real quickly, about Vicksburg perhaps being the Avis to the Hertz of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And what battle, so the U.S. history class from St. Louis University
great.
High School was listening and asked, do you think the siege of Vicksburg or the Battle of Gettysburg was more of a turning point in the war?
Well, I think Vicksburg was because of all the things I mentioned, the splitting of the Confederacy into farmers from the Midwest who are in revolt against the Lincoln administration because they can't get their crops down the river and out through New Orleans. Because at that point in the war, in early 1863, the river is a Yankee river except for the stretch between Vicksburg and a place called Port Hudson that had to be broken. And then there's all these long-term consequences of taking an army and fighting a different kind of war. Gettysburg is hugely important. For 25 years, I've been taking my students there. And it's an amazing, sacred place. But I think as recent Gettysburg historians have pointed out, it doesn't have strategic implications like Vicksburg. It doesn't have implications about liberation. Lee, captured some slaves and escaped slaves and sent them back south. Grant frees over 110,000 slaves by the end of 1863 in the Mississippi Valley and puts over 22,000 at least in Union Blue. I mean, these are huge consequences. I think the big consequence with Gettysburg is if the North had lost, it would have been calamitous. The fact that Meade holds on is important. But there's a scene at the end, there's a scene that I describe in the book when word of Gettysburg comes back, and word of Vicksburg comes back to the White House. It's July 7th. And Lincoln's sitting there with a map of Vicksburg in his lap, and Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary, is right across from him. And Gideon Welles, the Secretary of Navy, comes bursting in with a telegram from Porter. Vicksburg is ours. Well, that morning, Lincoln was profoundly depressed because at a cabinet meeting because he said Meade didn't pursue Lee. And that could have been the end of the war. And Lee goes back, and by the end of the summer, he has a respirited and refreshened army. And he goes right at Grant again at the end. I mean, but it's...
Now we've had numbers of times that famous newspaper printed on wallpaper, and I have to ask this when we're talking about Vicksburg, the Vicksburg Daily Citizen.
Yes.
And at the end, the Union troops found this on the bed, the printer's bed, but not finished, so they finished it off. And they say, 4 days bring great changes. And one of the things they say that that they'll never more eat fricasseed kitten. First of all, were they eating fricasseed kitten in there?
I don't
And then again, and what did Emma Belfour have to say about all this? And secondly, with this, why did they and the other Southerners in that area, if not across the South, really fight for this slavery issue when they didn't have slaves themselves? But why were they holding on in Vicksburg so long?
That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
Well, Emma Balfour
So,
is a woman of Vicksburg.
2 minutes.
And well, I deal with that a lot, why they fight. And I'll give you one example. Sidney Champion, on whose farm the Battle of Champion Hill was fought. When he's warning his wife, he's inside Vicksburg, he's warning his wife that Grant's at loose in central Mississippi and might be visiting our plantation. And he said, I saw and heard from people who were fighting in the North when the Yankees came through. And he describes them as vandals and Visigoths, entering homes, pillaging, things like that. And I think a lot of the guys on the line had that impression of Yankees, that they're down here and they're invading us and they're not fighting a civilized war. Jefferson Davis, who had a plantation near Vicksburg, came out to Vicksburg in late 1862, and in a fiery speech at Jackson, the capital, he said, we will never make peace with these people because of the depredations they're committing in Mississippi. And I think that's one of the reasons they're fighting that way. Emma Balfour saw it that way. She wrote a diary, and she said, I would rather die than succumb to the Yankees.
Well, you have a very extensive bibliography in here, and anyone who likes to look at bibliographies to see what further reading they can do, you'll have a lifetime of reading just from this bibliography, which is not bad. Just give us 2 or 3 essential readings in that bibliography that you think people should go away with if they want to know more about the campaign.
Well, I think Dana has a really good diary of the campaign. It's not a diary, it's a book on the campaign. He was close to Grant, and I think a guy named Cadwallader has a fine book called 3 Years with Grant.
Yes,
it's
very
controversial.
Yeah,
very controversial. A lot of
the
people,
drinking
and things like that. And I try to address that, but I think it's quite excellent. It's even better actually at the end when they're at City Point, and he's basically in control of almost all the newspapers at City Point. But you get verisimilitude. You get a real feel for the situation when you're inside this. But there's no better place to go than the memoirs of Sherman and the memoirs of Grant. They're first-class writers on par with Julius Caesar, another great, commander who wrote with great fluidity and style. And I think those 2 books, they're accessible. Sherman's a very good writer, and Grant's an even better writer. Spartan, diamond-hard sentences. That's where to go, to those sources. You feel the guys, you feel the man.
Let's talk about the other side for a moment. The Confederate generals they're up against, were they up to the task? Could they have done something different? Would it have been better for Lee to have sent Longstreet out there instead of being in Gettysburg,
Boy,
where he
that's a
also
tough
became
one.
controversial?
Yeah,
That's a speculation, but here you go.
Yeah, well, Longstreet wanted to go west.
Yes, he did.
He thought the war was going to be won in the west, and he might have made a difference at Vicksburg.
What about Pemberton?
I wanted to give a fresh interpretation of just about everything on the Vicksburg campaign. I could not with Pemberton. I mean, I'm not going to say he's an imbecile, but he just doesn't have imagination. And he loses every confrontation with Grant, a strategic move, a battle, and everything, because Grant is outthinking him a day ahead of time. You know, the Vicksburg campaign is entirely improvised. Grant has no maps. He's operating the situation's in constant fluidity, and Grant's making these snap, quick decisions, always a day or two ahead of Pemberton. Pemberton's always behind the 8 ball.
You have an appendix of the casualties from both sides. Besides just the raw data, is there anything that we learn or you learn from those casualties on each side and where they came from?
Well, they're relatively light when you compare them to Shiloh and to certainly to Gettysburg. And one of the reasons for that is Vicksburg was so hard to get. Part of the battle in the campaign for Vicksburg is just trying to find a way to get into the place. So there aren't many titanic battles. The biggest one, of course, is a real tough one at Champion Hill, which is, Churchill reputedly once said that was the most important battle of the Civil War, because it broke the back of Pemberton's army, and they scurried back and were chased back into Vicksburg. But there you have horrific casualties. But you don't at other places. They go into Jackson, to just give one example. Sherman and McPherson bombard the place. Joseph Johnson abandons it literally 24 hours after he arrived there to organize an army of relief. So that's what kept and during the siege, both sides had good protection against bombardment. The caves in Vicksburg and the little gopher holes that the Union soldiers built in the sides of the hills behind their lines.
I don't have one to show, or any to show, but which print or lithograph depiction of the siege do you like best? Do you like Kurz and Allison, Currier and Ives, something in Battles and Leaders? Is there one that you seem to think that caught your imagination?
Well, I have one in here of a typical Union rifle pit. And the guys are at their rifle stands, and their relief is right behind them. And I think what's important about this is it tells you why the North won the siege, because these guys are operating an assembly line process. They are relieved every 2 hours. And the Confederate boys slept on their guns in the open, no tents, and for the entire 47 days of the siege. And that, just the weather breaks them down, and disease. And Grant, by this time, has a supply line to the north. And you can see the guys, their uniforms are fresh. There's a lot of ammunition. It's coming in constantly. The Cairo supply line is working well. And Grant's army increases from 41,000 to over 70,000. And there's about 30,000 Confederates inside the city, and they just have to hold on.
Someone we haven't spoken about here are the nurses.
Yeah.
Mary Bickerdike. And in fact, here in Chicago, the Sanitary Commission from here, it seems, was one of the major contributors to materiel and maybe nurses and others, hospitals, to the Vicksburg campaign, the entire campaign.
Jane Hodge and Livermore, who I mentioned before, Mary Livermore, they gathered from local farmers all over the Midwest. This is an ambitious effort. Fruit, vegetables to prevent scurvy, medicine, homemade pies, and they went down to the camps, and they were morale boosters as well. Livermore knew a lot of the kids from her congregation in Chicago, and kids from the mercantile, organizations, the battalions that knew Mary, from the time they were 6 years old, and so they contributed a lot. Annie Whitmire, one of the nurses, formed 60 field hospitals up and down the Mississippi Valley. She'd been with Grant since Fort Donelson, and they show up and they're in the rifle pits. They're on the line at the siege situation. Jane Hodge actually had a son down there who was wounded during the battle. So they do play an important part in this struggle.
Mary Livermore's book, I agree with you, is undervalued and underread.
Yes, it is. I think it's a Civil War classic. I really do.
And we'll add that to the books that
Yeah.
people have to read.
She's a Jane Addams of the 19th century. I mean,
That's
she
a way,
really is.
good way to put it.
Yeah.
We're getting toward our end now. I just have one that I really wanted to ask about. Grant attacked on May 19th and May 22nd.
Yeah.
But why did he choose to assault twice? What did he think had changed that he assaulted again?
Well, initially, he didn't have all his units up. So the unit that was closest to the Confederate lines was Sherman's. So essentially that first day, it was a Sherman solo assault. The second day, it's a coordinated assault by all of his corps, all 3 corps commanders, straight across the line. And he's thinking, listen, this is a dispirited army that we chased back into its fortification. They were beaten up badly at Champion Hill. They're exhausted. He won 5 battles in a matter of 18 days against Confederate forces. And he thought, he's worried about Johnson forming in his rear. He doesn't want to get into a siege situation with Johnson back at Jackson, and he'd be caught between 2 armies. So ended right here. And that's why he goes at the second siege. That's understandable militarily. What's not understandable is why Grant, when all those kids the wounded were out in the field, and he refused to, the Confederate General Pemberton requested a ceasefire to bring in the wounded and bury the dead, and for almost a day, Grant refused to do that, and never explained it. Never explained it.
Even in his memoirs.
No, he doesn't touch it. Doesn't touch it. Yeah.
We're at the end, and this is such a book that is not only readable, people, it's chock full of all sorts of things, and the campaign is so wide and varied. We couldn't get to everything. Here are just some of the questions that I didn't get to, just so you know what you have to do to read this book. Champion Hill, we didn't talk about it. Chickasaw Bayou. We didn't talk about the settlements for the women and children,
Yeah.
freed women and children
Yes.
that were attacked by guerrillas
Yeah.
constantly, which I didn't really understand until I read your book. The conference that the Confederate generals, what their competence was. I think you talked about that a bit. Brand cigars, Union sharpshooters and sappers are going into detail. That's fascinating. I think you'll all get a lot of that, including the trenches and the mine explosion. It wasn't just out east we had a mine explosion. And the surrender agreement that Pemberton and Grant had that their aides had to do. I kind of think that maybe they were discussing when Pemberton and Grant went to sit on a log while they're...
I'd have loved to have been there.
Yeah, I would too. But I think they were probably discussing Mexican War tactics. They were both down there. I think, sure. Grant's relationships with Halleck and with Sherman. And, of course, his drinking. All of that and much more is in this terrific book that is now Miller on Vicksburg. I'm telling you that. So... let me tell you what's upcoming right here on the House Divided here in our broadcast studio at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. On Saturday, December 7th, we've heard of that date, at noon Central Time, Brian Dirk is going to be here for The Black Heavens, Abraham Lincoln and Death. Ron Keller is coming in as well with him for Lincoln and the Illinois Legislature. This is from the Concise Lincoln Library series. And something I think that you're going to want to hear these two historians together, as we used to do in the old virtual book signing days, huh? And you can pre-order these right now, or soon, I should say, at abrahamlincolnbookshop.com. Now? Okay, I'm told now. And then on Thursday, December 12th, we have this terrific book. I've been reading it, and fabulous. Erica Armstrong Dunbar, who's a National Book Award finalist for Never Caught, if you remember that. She came to slay the life and times of Harriet Tubman. There's a movie out right now, but I'm telling you, this is not associated with the movie. It's a terrific book. And I think you'll want to be here December 12th, Thursday at noon, or watch it afterwards. You can pre-order any of these books right now, and I think they'll all be interesting reading and good gifts for people as well, including, of course, Don Miller's Vicksburg. And if you're watching this on YouTube, after our broadcast, you can still order signed books as long as they last at alincolnbookshop.com. Well, Don, I want to thank you so much.
This is terrific.
And for the publisher, Simon & Schuster, bringing you in, I appreciate that very much. And it's $35, and it's terrific work. I think you'll like it. Thank you, the staff at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, for producing this show. We couldn't do this
I had a
without.
ball. It was great.
I enjoyed it too, Don. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all again.